All right, it's 11 o'clock. Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program's Homeowner Webinar Series. My name is Jen Marvin. I'm the Florida Yards Neighborhood Statewide Coordinator under FFL. Today we have Dr. Bart Schutzman speaking about tea, a horticultural and ethnobotanical perspective. Your microphones have been muted. If you have questions, please type them in the chat box and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Please stick around until the end of the presentation to take the survey. It helps me give you the kind of programming you like and lets us know how we're doing. Our next presentation will be November 16th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time on Introduction to Efficient Irrigation. Let me introduce Dr. Schutzman here. Bart Schutzman received his BS degree in plant science from the University of California at Davis in 1980 and his MS and PhD degrees in plant science from the University of Florida in 1982 and 1998, respectively. His fields of expertise is plant taxonomy. His MS and PhD research was conducted on systematics of Cycad genus Zamia in Mesoamerica. He did extensive field research in Mexico, discovered and named several species of Zamia and related cycads. He currently teaches plant identification courses in the Environmental Horticulture Department at the University of Florida and has taught residential horticulture and plant propagation. Dr. Schutzman is Director of Publications for the Cycad Society and was editor of the Cycad newsletter from 2000 until 2017. Welcome, Dr. Schutzman.
Thank you very much, Jen. And I'm glad to see so many people are here and are interested in a subject that's very dear to me. Just to give a little background more than the dry part of my education, I am kind of an enthusiast of all things of cultures of the world, and tea is a little microcosm of the entire world because tea has been spread in various ways all over the world since its beginnings several thousand years ago. So tea is a very good way to look at cultures and to see a lot of things about the world. And tea is also a delicious drink. So tea is actually, next to water, it's the most widely consumed beverage in the world. Now, had you asked me that some years ago, I would have thought that would be beer, but not true. It is tea. Now, America is mainly a coffee drinking country, and we'll discuss that a little bit later, but tea is gaining in popularity. Let's see if I can, here we go. Now, much of the early, quote, history of tea is kind of mixed up with legend and mythology because it's so long ago that no one really knows exactly. It wasn't documented exactly. But in the ancient history of China, there were several early rulers about 3000 BC who were called the three sovereigns and the five emperors. And one particular one by the name of Shen Nung, who was called the gentleman farmer or divine farmer. He was known for his interest in herbs and discovering useful plants, etc., and was responsible for a good bit of the pharmacopoeia of China, even today. And this particular emperor advocated for the drinking of hot water, which back then was probably a really good idea because microbes would be killed and whatnot, and so they regarded it as a very healthy drink. So at some point in legend, tea leaves from a nearby plant supposedly fell into this boiling water, and tea was the result. That's how it goes for roughly 5,000 or 5,500 years ago, somewhere like that. So that's a very interesting little tidbit. Now, later on, you have to fast forward a couple thousand years because people did continue to drink tea. And one of the more famous philosophers in Chinese civilization was Lao Tzu. and about 600 to 500 BC, wrote one of the famous treatises that's now the basis for Taoism. You may have heard of Taoism. And he wrote a work called the Tao Te Ching, where tea was actually central in, it's kind of a, I don't know, I don't want to call it a prop, but like an item that was used to promote proper behaviors, like preparing tea, being careful in how it's done and offering the tea to people. So you're generating generosity and all kinds of good behavioral practices. So tea was kind of central in the Taoist philosophy. And according to Lao Tzu, he said that tea was the elixir of immortality, but I think that's obviously an exaggeration because he's no longer with us. So if he is, someone please, send him to me. I want to know about it. Then later on, about 760 to 780 AD, another philosopher, Liu Yi, wrote the Cha Jing, or called the Classic of Tea, which is the first kind of a history, and it's quite a large work that talks about all different aspects of tea, including the early legends, how tea is prepared, etc. So the Classic of Tea, and that's the first known monograph about tea. Now, after this, if you were to do a little research, you'd see that many, many, many books have been written about tea, but this is the first, the Cha Jing. So here are a little list of some of the things I'd like to go over, some of them more briefly than others. But I want to start with the names of tea because that itself is a very interesting subject. Depending on where you are in the world, you will be using some variations on one of two roots that, that originated in China. Here's a sample of some of the different ways it's written, different alphabets and whatnot. But the two roots come from two different Chinese dialects. There are the Te words, and we know that one because we say tea, and that comes from the Hokkien dialect of Fujian province. And that one has spread to different parts of the world. And then there's the Cha root, which comes from Mandarin and Cantonese dialects, or the Guangdong province and others. So two basic roots. And what's very interesting is seeing how those two manifested themselves as the names of tea in different countries, areas all over the world. And what someone discovered at some point was that depending on where the area got its tea from at the beginning, influenced what the name used would have been. So if the tea came as shipments over from the sea and probably left from the Cantonese area or Guangdong province and landed in those places via the ocean, you would find that all the te roots have established themselves there as the words for tea. Now, on the other hand, if the tea came from the Mandarin areas and went over land, those ended up being the names in the chai or cha root in those areas. So Russia, Turkey, the Middle East, Persia, etc. So that's really, really interesting in and of itself. Now I want to talk just very briefly about tea's botany. Very little to say about it because I don't want to bore everyone to tears. But tea right now is regarded as the species Camellia sinensis. It used to be Thea sinensis, which Thea actually is the T word, Thea, in the European pronunciations. And that word faded away as the genus, as taxonomists included the tea plant in the genus Camellia. Now the family still uses the original name of Thea, and we still have the Theaceae. So that's kind of odd because as the genus, it's gone, but now we still have the family. Camellia name itself came from a Jesuit priest by the name of Kamel, George Kamel. Okay, so, and then the second word, the specific epithet sinensis, for those of you who haven't run into that before, is the Latin word for China. So that makes sense. So this is the Camellia from China, to sum it up. Now there are others, but this one is the most famous. Where does tea come from? So I've got a little green arrow pointing over here, but there's a place where India, Tibet, and China kind of come together. It's at the foothills of the Himalayas. And that's where tea is believed to have originated. Now, of course, 5,000 years having gone by, tea has been carried far and wide and grown in a lot of places, even as far as Africa. And we even have a tea plantation in South Carolina, I believe. So tea is grown in all kinds of places. Now, most people have heard of a plant family and heard of a genus, but we also have a section, which is a small subset of a genus, and it is called Thea, and there are actually 3 species in there. The Camellia sinensis, the one that is the most important, the main tea species, but the other 2 species in there are also used in their local areas for beverages. And now, in modern times, now that we have sophisticated breeding methods for plants, these other 2 species are being combined with sinensis in hybrids to try to produce better flavored and new types of tea, because that's where the money is to be made. Hold on. Some idiot forgot to turn his phone off. Okay, so getting back to the tea plant, it is an evergreen shrub. It can get quite large, but it is basically a shrub because it's multi-stemmed with simple alternate leaves. They're very finely toothed, and the flowers look like little tiny camellias. They're only about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, with parts generally in 5s, many stamens, and in the case of the tea plant, quite fragrant. And the fruit is considered what we call a capsule. It dries and opens up to release its seeds. So that's.
Hey, Bart,
Yeah.
your volume just went down a little bit. I'm not sure why.
How about now?
It's a little bit better.
Let me see if I can turn it up. I think it's at 100, so.
You might just need to sit closer to the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
How do I
That's
look?
better.
Is that all right? Can you
Yeah,
see
that's
all of
good.
me?
That's better. Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
All righty. So this next slide shows that there are actually, by some, considered to be 4 varieties of tea. We really only widely know 2 of them. One you may have heard of, it's called Assam tea. It's also called large leaf tea. And that one is generally found in India, growing wild. And the one from China is variety sinensis. So the Assam teas are very important in certain mixtures of teas, like if you've ever had Irish breakfast tea, that's a mixture with the Assam tea, or you can buy Assam tea by itself. The other 2 teas, I believe they are consumed only in very small localized areas, and they're not part of the large mercantile effort involved in the world's tea production. So there we go. So here's a view of what the tea plant looks like now when we're growing it. People keep it hedged so that the leaves are very easy to pick. So that's what you're seeing here. You're seeing kind of a mowed off shrub with the new leaves sticking out, and the tea pickers would go through and pick those leaves off. And when they're grown like that, they're only up to about, it would be hard to be 3 meters tall and still be picked like that. But I would say most of them are kept to 3 or 4 feet when they're being harvested like that. Now, if you get to some of the ancient plants, which are found decreasingly, they're being kind of wiped out. And I'll talk about that for a second. This tree was discovered, back around 2009, I believe, in the Yunnan province of China, and it's thought to be the Camellia thaliensis, one of the other tea species that's very closely related to sinensis. In fact, some people combine those. But anyway, once this tree was found, it became the largest and oldest specimen. They thought it was more than 1,000 years old, and I think in excess of 100 feet tall. I think this one was probably close to 100 feet. But tourism took its toll on this plant. People carved their names in it. They walked all around it, and within 2 years, the plant was dead. So the other thing that's going on with the very old plants is that there's a mistaken belief. It's kind of like a rumor, a propagated rumor that the older plants produce better tasting tea, which is not true at all. So what's the result of that? The people illegally go into areas and pick these old trees bare of leaves and basically kill them. So it's a very disturbing development. So here's another little close-up of a tea leaf, and you can see these little teeth along the margin, and it turns out that botanically they're very special, named after Thea, which was the tea name. So these are called theoid teeth. Now, what is different about a theoid tooth? I have no idea, and I never have been able to find out what's different about it, but I believe it's some anatomical difference, but just worthy to point out. Here's a little close-up of some of the flowers. You can see how small they are. They vary from 1 inch to 1.5 inches. And growing a tea plant in your yard is actually quite pleasant, because when one is doing well and it blooms, it's very fragrant. And if you know camellias, not that many camellias are fragrant, but this one is. When the plant finishes blooming, then the little capsules are produced, and they're called a loculicidal capsule. They break apart at the segments, and there can be 1 to 3 seeds per capsule. And if you were to get hold of some of these seeds, if they're fresh, you could just go ahead and plant them. No special treatment needed, just plant them in soil, and before long you'd have a cute little tea plant. So whenever I see anything about seeds, I would go right for it. You don't have to be a special trained horticulturist to grow these. It's one of the actually easiest camellias to grow. Now I want to get from botany into a little bit of the culture, which is kind of my favorite part of this. Since tea has such an ancient history, there's quite a bit of culture and tradition and ceremony built into tea over the millennia. So let's go back to these implements are dated and were found in digs, actually, and come all the way from the Tang Dynasty, somewhere around 1,500 years old. And so you can see that even in between 600 and 900 AD, the tea preparation had been quite a bit refined, even that long ago. So that makes it very fascinating to me. So little devices to hold the tea leaves and things to stir it, and probably all kinds of things are used. But after the Chinese development, which is thousands of years, so at some point around 700 to 800 AD, a Japanese monk by the name of Eichu supposedly brought tea to Japan. And that was a huge development for Japan because it became a cornerstone of their civilization. Japan has the most elaborate tea ceremony in the world. And that tea ceremony is either called Sado, which is the characters up here. The other name is called the Chanoyu, which just translates literally into water of tea. And the tea ceremony involves every aspect of preparing and serving tea to one's guests, all the way from how do you boil the water and how do you handle the tea leaves and how do you pour the water, how do you hand the cup to the person. And it's so elaborate that people who learn this ceremony can spend up to 10 years learning to do it properly. And that's mind-blowing for us here in the United States. When we don't really think about it, we just take out a Lipton tea bag and plunge it into a cup of hot water and there she goes. But the Chanoyu is a big deal in Japan for many centuries. And the people who basically learn this ceremony are the geishas and the makos, people who are training to do everything properly, and making tea and serving tea involves that. So the Chanoyu, the tea ceremony, really basically uses tea like a prop, but it is meant to develop the four the four principles of harmony, respect, and purity, which then leads to tranquility. So that's a whole lot in a mouthful of tea, isn't it? So along with this elaborated procedure, there are lots of little gizmos that are used. I use that term loosely, but one of the most interesting is the brazier and kettle called the furo and kama that is used to boil the water for the tea. And when I give this talk live, I have one of these that I bring in as a prop, but it's extraordinarily heavy, made out of cast iron. The bottom of this is where special pieces of charcoal made from a special tree, the sawtooth oak, that is a Japanese and Chinese species, is prepared and it's put into the bottom and lit. It's there to heat the water, and the water is kept in the top portion called the kama. And these items are very, very priceless. They're crafted meticulously in cast iron, can cost hundreds or even thousands of dollars, depending on how much goes into the creation of it. And they are definitely uncomfortably heavy. That's probably the biggest part of the ceremony, the biggest item. And the rest are different tools used to scoop the tea leaves, hold the tea leaves, to whisk them in the hot water, the cups to prepare the tea, etc. Now, when we get to the part where tea arrives in the West, it's much later, but we basically use kettles and cups, etc. And if you go back to the earliest ones, they're made out of porcelain, and even that came from China initially. So a lot of all of this began in China. So how did tea get to the West? This was much later, probably as early as the late 1500s, early 1600s. And tea was brought over for sale by the Dutch East India Company. And at the beginning, it was known to be a medicinal drink. But later on, at some point, when a princess from Portugal named Catherine of Braganza came to England in 1662, and she was coming there to marry King Charles II. But the little secret about her is that she was an avid tea drinker, and she brought with her the preparing and drinking of tea, which was already popular in Portugal and probably other parts of Europe. It got to England a little late. Of course, when royalty does something, then all the people want to do it as well. But what they found was an enormously expensive commodity, because 1 pound of tea at the time when it was first becoming popular was equivalent to an average worker's salary 9 months worth to buy 1 pound of tea. So that's crazy expensive. But by 1750, apparently the British were importing nearly 5 million pounds of tea per year. So it was still expensive, but probably the costs had been driven down a little bit, because nobody wants to spend nine months of their salary on a pound of tea, even today. So the British were very eager to try to bring this cost down, because they knew this was a very profitable drink. So they involved a Scottish botanist and explorer by the name of Robert Fortune. Robert Fortune was responsible for introducing some 250 different plants to England, America, and Australia back in the 1800s. So what happened with Robert Fortune is they hired him to go to China and try to bring tea from there that could be cultivated, so that they could break themselves out of the grip of paying the Chinese much more money than they thought they should have to pay them. Of course, they probably wanted to pay them 2 cents so that they could continue to charge people 9 months of their salary. But that beyond the point. They were looking to decrease the cost, so they hired Robert Fortune, who was quite successful by then. And at the time they hired him in the 1800s, it was very, very difficult to bring living plants from anywhere to Britain, especially if a sea voyage was involved. At that time, many people were trying to cultivate orchids. That was when orchids were going crazy. In fact, horticulture was in a big boom in the 1800s. But what Robert Fortune did, which was, it probably made him a fortune, is he invented a device called the Wardian Case, which is essentially a little portable greenhouse. And when it was discovered that plants could grow successfully even under what normally would be considered miserable conditions, they could grow successfully in these little portable greenhouses. He found that he was able to transport 20,000 plants and seeds from China, which he went hither and thither and bought them from people. But essentially from China, he was smuggling this material. So the British smuggled, with the help of Robert Fortune, 20,000 plants and seeds. And where did they go? They brought them to India, where they attempted to create a tea plantation to use these Chinese tea plants. It was a great idea, but ultimately use of the Chinese plants failed because they all died, and none of that worked. Even after he figured out how to get them there alive, they couldn't keep them alive, I guess because they were ecologically not adapted to the area in which they brought them. What they did find, however, was that nearby, the variety Assamica was growing wild right in the hills near the plantation where they had spent so much money to bring all those tea plants and seeds from China. They could have just gone to the hills and planted what already was there and been vastly more successful. But at least today we have the Wardian Case, which is a very, wasn't a very important piece of furniture. It ended up being in Victorian homes because you could have a little fernery and orchid greenhouse in a very small space sitting in your fairly dark living room in Victorian days and keep it alive. And Wardian cases are nice pieces of furniture. If you look them up on the web, you can see all the different permutations of this. So once Britain was firmly established with tea, of course, it came to the colonies. And that was turned out to be a big problem because the British loved to levy taxes, and everybody has heard of the Boston Tea Party. Well, what happened was the British made a huge tax on tea that the colonists felt was not fair and unwarranted. And you remember the phrase taxation without representation. And that's what prompted them to, the most radical of them, to dress up as Native Americans, jump aboard 3 ships that were transporting tea to the colonies, and dump several hundred chests of tea valued at today's value about $3 million off the ships. And they got ruined in the salt water. So this basically eventually resulted in the Revolutionary War, but it also resulted in America not wanting to drink tea, because tea was a symbol of the terrible British tax levies. So people boycotted tea. And guess what we drink now? We drink coffee, even to this day, 200 odd years later. America is still a coffee drinking country because of that problem with the British. Now, tea is starting to get popular now, but it's taken, what, 250 years? So quite a long time for a comeback. While in England, there was no let up, and tea became as important in the everyday life. Taking tea was very, very crucial to the day of a proper British household, and was even portrayed in things like children's books, such as Through the Looking Glass, which you're looking at a plate from it from 1865. And during all of this development, the expansion of the plantations, which were in India and then also Sri Lanka, today Sri Lanka, formerly Ceylon, grew enough tea to replace 2/3 of all the imports from China by the 19th century. Now let's look at one other little pathway. Now, you know, there are lots of these. I've just chosen a few that are of interest to present to you, just so that you have an idea of how tea traversed the world. So let's look at Russia for a few minutes, because they had quite a different experience. The Chinese decided in 1638 to make a gift of tea to the current Tsar of Russia, who was Mikhail Fyodorovich Romanov, of the famous but ill-fated Romanovs. But back in 1638, they weren't being threatened as they were by the Russian Revolution, so this one wasn't shot. But he got this gift of a chest of tea leaves and promptly looked at it and said, "Why would I want a box of dead leaves?" And he rejected the gift, which was, well, it's pretty rude too. I don't know what happened to it, but he didn't use it. I guess no one bothered to tell him that you brew it and make a drink out of it. So it took another 50 years before tea actually successfully became established in Russia. And to get to Russia, that tea had to travel the Silk Road on camels. So basically, it took a year to get from China to Russia over the Silk Road on the back of a camel. Now, once it got to Russia, some interesting developments, like the creation of a beautiful implement called the samovar, which is used to brew tea in Russia, actually also Turkey and Iran. And I think there's some difference of opinion where it actually originated, but that implement is firmly established in all of those cultures. And basically what it consists of is a pot of hot water at the bottom, and then a very concentrated kettle of tea at the top, so that if you were going to make a cup of tea, you poured some of the concentrate into a cup and then you added water to fill. So that concentrate could make the entire pot of water there in tea. Why they kept it separate, I have no idea, but maybe just because different people wanted it in different strengths. And that you can certainly do that. You can make yourself a stronger cup of tea if you do it this way. So some of ours are very important over there in Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And they even made it to a Soviet stamp in the 80s. So here you can see that. Now, with that little bit of history past, let's move on to a little bit of horticulture. Since we know that tea has been used for nearly 5,000 years, it's been grown for that long because the minute people know that they can use something, they'll want to grow it. So you will find tea horticulture very well developed in China, where you can see this is an entire landscape of tea with different colored emerging leaves and mature leaves. So you can see there's different forms of the plant, and they can be kept pruned to different sizes. So you actually can make a landscape out of them if you wanted to do something quite that boring. I don't know. I think I would want to have something else in there besides tea plants, but maybe you know, supply all the tea you need for the household this way. But the tea plant is generally grown 3 to 6 feet tall. And for us, it's hardy down to about 10 degrees Fahrenheit, although there are forms of tea that have survived lower temperatures, like into the single digits Fahrenheit, and can be grown successfully in most of the southeastern United States. Now, it is said that growing the plant at cooler temperatures gives the leaf a better flavor. But heck, you know, if we can grow it here and have any kind of flavor, it might be worthwhile. And plants can be successfully grown here, even in Florida. They like well-drained soils. We have those. Fertile, maybe not so much, but we can fertilize. We do have acidic soils that are sandy and can be kept moist. So the only thing tea really doesn't like is very, very hot and strong sunlight. So it's best to grow them in shadier areas here in Florida. And I think here definitely we have to be more concerned about the heat. Now in the Himalayan foothills, the intensity of the sun is much different. So there the plants can be grown in full sun, and especially since they're at higher elevations and it's much cooler up there. So much different than Florida, but it's a testament to the plant that we actually can still grow it at all. Now, in the Asian countries like China, where tea is grown successfully, the fact that they are often in terraced land on hillsides proves that the good drainage is so important to the growing of the tea plant. Now, these plantations are so beautiful that ecotourism has been promoted. A lot of people like to go visit tea plantations now. Here's another beautiful example of terraced tea in a Chinese tea plantation. Here's one in Hangzhou, China. Very nice, and tourists are allowed to go through. Mostly, they don't like them to pick the tea, but really it's quite a lovely sight. I would like to go and see it myself, but I've seen lots of photos, but never have had the good fortune to go see it in person. Now this is an interesting terraced tea plantation. You can see all the different colors. This is in Darjeeling, India. And you know, Darjeeling has its own kind of tea called Darjeeling tea. But these plants are probably different clones in different stages of their development. So like the white parts there are probably in full bud. They haven't, the leaves haven't come all the way out and been harvested yet. So when the leaves are very, very small and in bud, they're quite hairy. The hairs are concentrated and white, and that's why these would look so white. And you've heard of white tea, and white tea is generally picked at the bud stage, and that's probably why they call it white, along with the fact that the brew that comes out of it is much lighter colored than regular tea. So here's a Malaysian plantation, and they made it pretty clear they don't want you messing around with the plants. You get to look, but don't touch. Flavor of tea. Now, if I were to ask the general population what makes tea have different flavors, they might think it's all down to different varieties, but actually it's quite the opposite with tea. Quite a bit of it has to do with the way it's prepared, and how old it is when it's picked, and the type of provenance. Now, you know, provenance is most important, and we know about it with wine grapes, but provenance is very important with tea as well. Now, the variety and cultivar will have something to do with it, but you can take a really good variety and cultivar and ruin the tea by doing any of the following 4 things wrong. So the other twist on this is that there are so many different variables that probably the end cup of tea has thousands and thousands of permutations depending on what has changed in any of these factors. So let's mention a little bit about the types of tea. And I like to break it down into the 3 basic types that we know and deal with, and mostly we just know about 2 of them. In America, the most popular are the green and the black tea, and those can be the very same plants that are supplying those leaves, and I'll explain why. So you see I've got degree of oxidation there. So oxidation is the process when oxygen is incorporated chemically into the living tissue of the plant, and generally, like you see it when you cut an apple and you see it turning brown where you've cut it, that's oxidation. Now with tea leaves, when the leaf is damaged or crushed or bent or folded, all those little areas basically turn black. And let's extend that process. If you harvest some fresh tea leaves and you bruise them all up and you let them sit around long enough, that tea will turn into black tea. And black tea is generally, I think, people's favorite, except when you get to certain areas like Japan, green tea is it. In China, all of the teas are consumed. And if you want to go to the green tea, now the green tea, the emphasis in producing that is for there to be little or no oxidation whatsoever, to be dried and cured, mostly just dried as quickly as possible so that none of the oxidation takes place, and that gives the tea a much different flavor. Now, the oolong is anything in between the quick drying and the long oxidation process. So it could be anything in between. So oolong teas, therefore, have quite a bit of variation in them. And there are lots of different closely guarded secrets and processes that different tea growers have to produce oolong teas, and they are quite delicious. Now, there's one other type of tea, and it hasn't caught on in America, or I think even generally in Europe, it hasn't caught on that much. But this tea is a black tea that then has been subjected to fermentation. So not only do they harvest it and dry it and bruise it and oxidize it, but they also allow it to ferment over a period of time. And sometimes that period of time can be as long as 15 or 20 years, okay? So imagining putting fermentation on tea leaves, you can't even begin to imagine what this stuff could taste like. Now, some people compare pu'er tea to the cheese of tea. Now, if that tells you anything, it tells you that there might be, for some people, some off-putting flavors. Now, when I tasted it, I wasn't that fond, but there are so many different producers who do different things to prepare this, and some may claim to store it for 15 or 20 years, but then use a shortened process that was invented some 50 years ago to try to make that go faster. So like everything that can be copied or imitated or faked, pu'er tea is one of them, because the very long fermentation process makes this tea very, very expensive when you get the real thing. So that also means that there will be some unscrupulous people that will try to come up with a fake and charge you the price and tell you it's 20 years old. So you always have to watch out for that. So in a certain sense, you have to be quite an expert on this particular type of tea to tell whether it's really the good stuff or not. And I think the one I had was a cheap one and maybe not so good. So I kind of thought of it tasted like a fish broth, but anyway, I don't want to discourage other people from trying it, because I think probably in there, if you get some of the good pu'er tea, that it could turn out to be quite nice. And there are literally millions and millions of people in China who swear by it. It's supposed to have health benefits as well. So health, I mentioned health, and it's been rumored that tea is healthy for a long, long, long time. But now we have a few bits of information that we've determined about tea. Helpful for blood pressure, your intestinal flora, the immune system, helps with cholesterol, lipids, fluorides that are in tea, and that's a very unusual compound, but the fluorides are in all the teas, and they actually help your tooth enamel. In fact, if you go to China, one of the flavors of toothpaste is tea flavored. And recently, I think they found that there's actually help with cognitive decline. So I guess I better get on it, start drinking some more tea. Anyway, so tea is a very healthy substance. All right, that's really all I want to say about the actual tea plant, but I want to mention about other so-called teas. It's really not proper to say that word for anything but the actual tea plant. So the real term for it is tisanes. If you infuse anything else and drink it, it would be called a tisane or an infusion, if you want to use the proper term. Now, you will find plenty of products on the market that call themselves tea, like it might say mint tea or kombucha tea or whatever. So it's not really tea, not if you want to be technical about it. One of the more famous ones, I remember it because my dad used to drink it every day, every evening, and it is Kava Kava, or Piper methysticum, which is a plant related to black pepper. And when harvested, the whole plant is pulled up and the roots are used to make the tisane. It's called Kava Kava, and it has a calming effect. My dad drank it. He made a mixture called calm tea that actually did change his mood and his attitude. So the only problem with Kava Kava, if you don't trust oh, wait a minute. Yeah, if you don't trust the supplier, you have to be careful, because parts other than the roots can have a level of toxicity for the liver. So you want to have strictly the root infusion. Another tea very well loved in the Middle East and now elsewhere is mint tea. And that one is very useful for gastric problems and to help digestion, and apparently also helps with cholesterol and has sedative effects. That doesn't count mint juleps, although they do taste good. Another popular tea, one I'm not as fond of, but I know a lot of people swear by it, is chamomile. And it is said to have anti-cancer and antibacterial properties. Helps with diabetes and some other things. And that, as you can tell, is a kind of a daisy, so that's in the aster family. One of the more useful teas is made from ginger. That one is not only delicious, but it is extremely useful for digestion. And whenever I get a stomach ache, if I get one, all I have to do is make some ginger tea, which you can also get prepared and just has to be dissolved in hot water. And lo and behold, you will feel better, guaranteed. Ginger tea. And you can also get the fresh rhizome, or some people call it the root, chop it up into fine pieces and boil that for 20 or 30 minutes, strain the pieces out of it, and then you can either cool it down or drink it hot. So digestion helps reduce flatulence, nausea, and vomiting, and good for colds and flus. And I haven't tried it for migraines, but it's quite a good infusion, ginger tea. Now the other one, I think this is probably the one I want to end at, is Yerba Mate, and that one is the South American plant. It's actually the genus Ilex, which is holly. Now I know you all know holly, and even in the United States, we have native hollies that teas were made out of, like Ilex vomitoria, the yaupon. That's a bad name because really it was not used to make people vomit, but actually a tea was made out of it. And I think there was a misunderstanding about if one drank too much of the native Ilex that you could throw up. But it too has qualities similar to Yerba Mate, and also the Native American peoples would make a tea from our Florida native Ilex casein. I've not tried it, but actually we have kind of a controversy because it's difficult. I have plants growing here at the University of Florida that were sold to us as Yerba Mate plants, but they are the spitting image of Ilex casein. So I'd like to really get down to what's the difference between them. But in Brazil and places in South America, they grind the leaves up into a powder, put it in hot water, and drink it through a special straw that filters the leaves out. So when you sip it, you don't get a mouthful of powdery leaves. And Yerba Mate is supposed to be very nutritious, documented by the Pasteur Institute to be packed with vitamins and minerals, and of great nutritional value. So with that, I'd like to conclude and say that tea is something that you can study your whole life and probably not know everything about it. And I encourage you to follow through and learn some more if you'd like it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Schutzman. Do you have time for questions?
I do.
Great. Let me look in the chat here. I know one of the first questions was, where can I buy a tea plant?
I've seen them even at the big box stores. I bought one at Lowe's before. So I think it's just a matter of keeping your eye out.
And
I
you
probably could buy them online as well. I would Google tea plant, and you may be able to get seeds or plants from an online source.
can you have them in a pot or in ground?
The ones I have now, I have some in the ground, but I also have some in a pot, and you can grow them successfully in a pot. They just won't be as large. They won't grow as big. So the limitation in size would be by your pot size. But I guess you could put them up into a huge pot if you wanted to, and use it as something in your doorway, or yeah. So they grow well in pots.
How about in a greenhouse? Would they do okay in a greenhouse?
Mine have been in the greenhouse and they seem okay. I think you just have to watch out and not overwater them. They like to be well drained, and that's the thing about putting them in a pot. You have to then be more careful about the soil and make sure that that soil has proper drainage. It can't be too mucky, right? It should have some good sand and proper drainage holes in the bottom of the pot, etc. So once you put a plant in a pot, you have more responsibilities.
Okay. Why is oolong so expensive?
Well, I buy oolong and it's not very expensive. It shouldn't be, unless it's a very special brand or one that's particularly known to be excellent. But I've not found that the ones that I get are any more expensive than a decent black tea, actually.
Okay. when you were showing us the benefits, the health benefits of tea,
Mhm.
which teas were the studies of?
That's a good question. Uh, and I really can't tell you. I didn't delve that far into it. But I know that green tea has been studied, so it's not hard to find those studies. So I would guess that green teas were probably predominantly studied, but I wouldn't guarantee it's all of it, because black tea is also very important. So I'm sure people worked on it as well.
Okay,
So maybe I'll have to do a little more homework on that and then include that in the next time.
okay. Is Kava Kava the drink that has an additive effect, i.e. the more you drink, the greater you feel the sedation?
That's a good question. My dad, I only know from the experience of my dad. I haven't drank. I've tasted kava, but I never made a habit of drinking it. But he always put the same amount in his mix. So, I don't know whether more is better or not in that particular case. But I think the major concern should be whether you have just the root material. That's probably the most important there. But as far as whether it's additive, whether more is more sedative or not, I really don't know.
Okay,
That would take someone who's really into therapeutics.
well, somebody wants to know if you have a book. So I think you might need to start writing a book on tea.
Oh, if I have a book,
Yes.
I mean, it would probably be a book I'd never finish, but that would be fun. I've seen some books, and it seems like every one of them has some of the things I like, but not all. So maybe that's a clue,
Yeah.
because tea horticulture is now getting to be much more important. And but I think people too, maybe not all of them are as interested as I am in the ethnobotany of the plant.
Mhm.
I think it's a good method to study ethnicities and cultures, which to me is very fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. What is a tea olive?
Oh, well, tea olive. So it's not a tea. It's actually it's a plant in the olive family, and it's not even in the tea family. Let's see. Try to come up with this real fast here. Let's see which one I want to mention, because there's several species of osmanthus, and
Okay.
osmanthus fragrans is the one that we grow. And the only reason that they call it tea olive is because the fruit looks like a little olive, and it's in the olive family, the Oleaceae. But there's no relation to actual tea. However, the fragrant tea olive has very tiny flowers that are gathered in China and sold, and those are added actually for flavoring in tea, because they're
Okay.
quite, they have a floral, a delightful floral note that, just like jasmine flowers are added to tea to make jasmine tea.
Mhm.
So they also do that with tea olive.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Interesting. What kind of yield can I expect from one in-ground plant, and how old should the plant be before harvesting?
One in-ground plant is going to take a long time before, if it were me growing it, I probably wouldn't touch it for some years. I would want to make it a plant as big as me. I think you would have to have basically a whole hedgerow of them to feel comfortable, picking a lot, unless you're just looking to make one cup at a time, or one pot at a time. I don't think one plant would be very rewarding unless it was quite shrubby and large. By the time, I wouldn't want to pick any more than, 1 or 2% of the leaf mass on that plant before I would start feeling uncomfortable about setting it back.
Okay.
Yeah, when they grow them as hedges, they're picking really very little of that plant. So yeah, I think the tendency would be by people to want to overpick. So my thing would be to encourage you to plant several plants. If you think that's what you want to do, I'd put a whole hedgerow of them in.
Okay. Do tea leaves have to be dried before use, or can you use freshly picked leaves?
I think that really to get the flavors out of them, I believe they have to be dried. I've not heard of any fresh tea leaf tea consumption. Never heard of it before. So even the green and the white teas, which they pride themselves on as little time oxidizing as possible, those too are even dried very quickly. But I don't know, there's nothing to say you couldn't try picking leaves on your own plant and just brewing them. It wouldn't be harmful. There's nothing harmful in the leaf.
Okay. Can I dry tea in a dehydrator, or should it be done slowly at room temperature?
Well, that would go back to the whole thing about, are you trying to make a green tea or are you trying to let it oxidize more? So if you were going to attempt to make a black tea, you'd want to pick those leaves, and then you'd want to, like before machines did it, you could take those leaves and roll them in your hand and basically roll the leaves into balls. And that would damage them enough so that they could oxidize. And then you would put them in a slow drying environment. You don't want to dry them too fast. You want to give them time for the flavors to develop. So you would roll them up and put them in a place, not in the sun. It would have to be, you know, a shaded spot that gets decent air circulation so that you wouldn't start a fermentation process. You don't want that. And then decide when you want to try it. I mean, because obviously this is going to be a trial and error situation for all of us if we want to start brewing our own tea.
Yes. You've had a request for perhaps a future backyard tea plant presentation. So maybe,
Backyard tea plant presentation.
yeah,
Okay,
maybe
well,
infusions and that
that
sort
would
of
be
thing.
cool. Well, I'm gonna have to try and get a little area set aside here to grow a nice row of them. I've got a few outside, but I have a feeling that once they start to get to be some size, that the general public's going to start picking them for me. So I'm going to have to put them inside my complex so that I can have them intact when I go to do that. But
Okay, are Chinese teas imported in the United States into Asian stores inferior, especially the slimming teas, and are some laced with pesticides?
oh, that's a really good question. It's not something I've ever dealt with, but I think that you would have to develop a trusted brand mentality there, you know, and decide what, maybe do some research and see if there are any brands that are, you know, certified to our satisfaction. Of course, you know, people are distrustful of a lot of products that come from China because there have been problems with, I've never heard of it happening with tea, but I've heard of it happening with things like Five Spice, where an unscrupulous company will send you the wrong species and some of them are toxic. Or, you know, pesticides, that's an issue, but I've never really heard of the tea plant having large pest problems. So maybe that's something that really doesn't exist.
Okay. What about tea in Australia? Do you know
No,
anything about
no,
tea in
nothing,
Australia?
no, nothing of it, except that I understand there is some tea being grown there, but I don't know the details. I do know that in some of the places outside China that people have been growing the large leafed or the Assamica variety, and that may be the case in Australia. I haven't focused on it specifically, but I would
Okay.
guess that they probably were trying to grow Assamica.
Okay. Which tea is best for sleep, and how long does it take to feel sleepy?
Oh, tea is not what would not be my go-to for sleep.
I wonder if they mean infusion,
Oh, an infusion.
maybe.
The infusion I would have would not be tea for one, because that's going to give you caffeine. and also theine, or I forget, theophylline, and there's some things that are in tea that would tend to keep you up. But as far as infusions go, I would look to the calm teas, what they call the calm teas, or the Kava infusions, and all of the relatives. My dad's had Kava and like 4 other things. One of them was valerian, and I know they use that. Boy, that's stinky stuff, but it's sworn by in the people that take it to calm down, and there is a sleepy time tea that has some of that material in it already.
Okay, there are a few other questions, but I know that you have a prior engagement, Dr. Schutzman. I have a lot of thank yous and love this talk. How can I get it for later? And I just wanted to let everybody know that you can find it on the Florida Friendly Landscaping page, floridafriendlylandscaping.com, and under resources and webinars. It'll take me about 2 weeks to put it up, and you can view it there along with the rest of our homeowner webinar series.
Yeah, so I guess that one will be the one until we can replace it with what each time is a new and improved version. So
And some people want part 2.
we'll
So
have to start thinking about part 2, because part
Yeah.
1 is of great interest to me. So
well, thank you very much, Dr.
appreciate
Schutzman.
it. Thank
Have
you.
a great day.
You all take care.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.